The sound of a backhoe pulling a magnolia tree out of the ground is a sound that a daughter does not forget. The roots of a southern magnolia, the kind my mother planted in our backyard the spring I was born, run 12 feet deep. They take 44 years to grow. They take 8 minutes for a man with a yellow excavator and a $30,000 contract from a developer to rip out of the earth. I drove down our street in Ardsley Park, Savannah, on a Monday afternoon in late April. I was coming back from a 3-day weekend at my sister Caroline's house in Charleston. I had not seen our house in 3 days. I saw the backhoe before I saw the house. There were 2 of them, big yellow Kubota excavators parked in our backyard with their arms in the dirt. The roses my mother had grown for 30 years were on the ground in a pile. The hydrangeas were torn out at the roots. The dogwood she had planted the year I left for college was on its side. The wisteria she had trained over the back fence for 2 decades was hanging in shreds from a half-broken trellis. And the magnolia. The magnolia my mother had planted the week she brought me home from Memorial Hospital in 1982. The magnolia I had climbed every summer until I was 16. The magnolia that had bloomed at her funeral 5 years ago, when we had buried her on a Tuesday in May. The magnolia was on its side. The roots were exposed. The white blossoms were already starting to brown. I parked my car at a wrong angle on the street. I left the engine running. I left the door open. I walked into my own backyard and I sank to my knees in the dirt next to the magnolia. I put my hands on the bark. I tried to breathe. My husband, Greg, was standing on the back porch with a paper coffee cup in his hand. He had heard me drive up. He was waiting for me. "Emma, I was going to call you." The crew came earlier than I thought. I could not speak. "Honey, we talked about Atlanta. The apartment is more than I thought. I needed the money. The developer offered $300,000 cash for the lot. I closed last Friday." I still could not speak. "Em, it is just a garden. Mom's been gone for 5 years. We'll plant something in Atlanta." "I promise." I looked at him from the ground. What my husband did not know, what he had no way of knowing as he stood on that porch with his coffee cup, was that the woman who lived next door to us, the woman who had hired me 3 months earlier to design the flowers for her only daughter's wedding, was watching the entire scene from her front window. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, and in less than 4 hours, she was going to call a crew of 12 professional gardeners and move every plant my husband had not yet destroyed onto her own property. But to understand how Eleanor Whitfield ended up moving my mother's roses across a fence on a Monday night in April, I have to take you back to the spring of 1982, when my mother first put her hands in the dirt of the Ardsley Park backyard. My name is Emma Carter. I am 46 years old now, and I grew up in a small house on 48th Street in Ardsley Park, Savannah, Georgia. My mother, Margaret Carter, was a librarian at the Savannah Public Library for 31 years. She was also, in her free time, the person who built one of the most beautiful private gardens in Chatham County. My mother was raised on a small tobacco farm outside Asheville, North Carolina. Her own grandmother, my great-grandmother Pearl, had been the unofficial rose breeder of 3 counties. In 1962, when my grandmother packed up the farm to move to Savannah after my grandfather died, my grandmother brought a single cutting of a rose that her own mother had bred in 1941. The rose did not have a name. The family called it Pearl's Rose. It was a deep coral color with petals shaped like a peony. It bloomed twice a year, in May and in October. My mother planted the cutting of Pearl's Rose in the backyard of our Ardsley Park house in April of 1982, the same week she found out she was pregnant with me. When I was born, in November of that year, my mother planted a southern magnolia in the corner of the yard, next to the rose. My grandmother told me, when I was 6 years old, that my mother had walked the magnolia sapling all the way home from the nursery on Bull Street in a wheelbarrow, with me on her lap, 3 weeks after my birth. I learned to garden when I was 4 years old. By the time I was 8, I knew the difference between a bourbon rose and a tea rose. By the time I was 12, I had grafted my first rose. By the time I was 16, my mother and I had built 3 additional flower beds in the yard, including the famous border of antique hydrangeas that ran along our entire back fence. I went to the University of Georgia for college. I studied landscape architecture and horticulture. I came back to Savannah at 23, and I worked for 9 years as a floral designer for one of the oldest event companies in the city. I built bouquets for senators' daughters. I built arrangements for the historic homes on Ardsley Park. I was, in the small world of Savannah weddings, what you called a name. People knew me. I met Greg Carter when I was 33. Greg was an underwriter at one of the regional insurance firms. He was originally from Atlanta. He had moved to Savannah for a regional manager promotion. He was charming, ambitious, organized. He liked the way I made things grow. He told me, on our second date, that I was the first woman he had ever met who knew the Latin name of every plant in her own backyard. We got married when I was 35. We moved into my mother's house. My mother had been diagnosed with breast cancer the year before. She lived with us for the last 3 years of her life. She passed away when I was 38. When my mother died, she left me 3 things: the house, the garden, and a small leather notebook of every plant she had grown over 30 years, organized by date and location, with little sketches in the margins. I kept the notebook in the kitchen drawer. I closed my floral design business when my mother got sick. I told my employer I needed to focus on her care. After she died, I did not go back. Greg told me I did not need to. He had just been promoted to district manager. He told me I should take some time. I stopped working professionally for 5 years, but I never stopped gardening. I kept my mother's garden alive every single day for 5 years. I pruned the magnolia. I deadheaded the roses. I divided the irises. I rebuilt the trellis when a hurricane took out half of it in 2021. I quietly grew bouquets for friends' weddings, for my niece's bat mitzvah, for the funeral of a neighbor across the street. I never charged anyone. The garden was where I went to be with my mother. By the spring of 2024, the year this story really begins, I had been doing exactly that for 5 years. Greg never went into the backyard. He worked 60-hour weeks. He played golf at the Savannah Golf Club on Saturdays. He did not know the names of any of the plants my mother had loved. I do not think Greg ever once stood in our backyard for longer than 10 minutes in the 11 years of our marriage. Greg's promotion came through in February of last year. He came home from work on a Tuesday evening with a bottle of champagne. He told me he had been promoted to Vice President of Regional Operations for the entire Southeast. He told me the firm was relocating him to the corporate office in Atlanta. He told me they wanted him in the Atlanta office by July. He told me we were moving. I put my fork down. Greg, the house, my mother's garden. We talked about this. The house has been on the market in our heads for years. Atlanta is a bigger life. We are going to buy a beautiful condo in Buckhead. You will love it. I do not want to leave the house. Honey, the market is hot. We can sell the house for almost $400,000. We use that for the down payment in Atlanta. It is the smart move. I did not argue with him that night. I let him celebrate. I drank a glass of champagne. I went upstairs. The next morning, I went into the backyard at 6:30. I sat on the bench under the magnolia. I cried for 40 minutes. Then I went inside and I made coffee, and I told Greg very calmly that I would consider Atlanta, but I would not sell the house. I told him my plan. I would rent the Savannah house out, fully furnished, for the years we lived in Atlanta. I would keep the garden in good shape. We would come back on weekends. The house would stay in the family. Greg said okay. He told me he would talk to a real estate agent about getting the house ready to be a rental. I trusted him. I should not have trusted him. For the next 2 months, Greg told me almost nothing about the move. I asked him 3 times in March whether he had found a realtor. He said yes. He said her name was Janelle. He said she was working on it. In early April, I started planning the spring planting. I bought new dahlias for the back border. I divided the iris bed. I cut back the wisteria. I told my sister Caroline on the phone that I was getting the garden ready for an entire summer of bloom because I wanted the house to be photographed for the rental listing in late May. On the third Friday of April, my sister Caroline called me. Her husband had just been admitted to the hospital in Charleston for a minor heart attack. She asked me to come up for the weekend. I told Greg I was leaving on Friday afternoon. I would be back Monday late afternoon. He said fine. He said he had golf on Saturday and was going to work in the home office on Sunday. He kissed me goodbye at noon on Friday. What he did not tell me when he kissed me goodbye was that the closing on the sale of our backyard lot to a residential developer named Coastal Land Partners had been scheduled for that exact Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. at a title company on Bay Street. Greg had sold the house and the lot to a developer. Greg had told the developer that we were moving. Greg had told the developer that he had full authority over the property because both of our names were on the deed. Greg had received a check for $300,000 on Friday afternoon while I was driving north on Interstate 95 toward Charleston. The developer had moved a crew onto the property at 6 o'clock on Monday morning. By the time I drove down our street at 3 p.m. on Monday, 60% of my mother's garden had already been destroyed. I do not remember everything that happened in the first 30 minutes after I parked my car. I remember kneeling next to the Magnolia. I remember my hands on the bark. I remember Greg's voice from the porch, far away, like he was calling to me through water. Honey, we'll plant something in Atlanta. I promise. I remember the foreman of the crew, a man named Tony, walking over to me with a clipboard. He was wearing a yellow safety vest. He had a cigarette behind his ear. Ma'am, are you Mrs. Carter? I nodded. I am sorry to bother you, ma'am. We were going to do the front yard tomorrow, but we have a delay. Are you going to be removing any of the personal items in the front before we start? I looked at him. I tried to understand what he had just said. What personal items in the front? The rose bush by the front porch. We are pulling that one tomorrow morning. The developer wants the entire lot cleared by Friday so they can start surveying for the new structure. I stood up. My knees were covered in dirt. Tony, what did you just say? He looked at me, then at Greg on the porch, then back at me. Ma'am, I am sorry. I thought you had been informed. The whole property was sold last Friday. We are not just clearing the back. We are clearing the entire property. The buyer is putting up a duplex. I turned to look at Greg. Greg was already walking back into the house. I stood in the middle of the backyard for a long time. I did not move. I think I was waiting for something to make sense, but nothing was going to. I walked into the house. I went into the kitchen. I opened the drawer where my mother's leather notebook had lived for 5 years. The notebook was gone. I went back outside. I walked through the destruction. I started to dig through the piles of plants the crew had pulled out. I found the irises. I found 3 of the dahlias. I found 2 clumps of the antique hydrangeas. I could not find the magnolia roots intact. I could not find the original Pearl's rose, the one my great-grandmother had bred in 1941. The Pearl's rose had been in the bed closest to the back of the lot, which was where the crew had started. I sat down in the dirt. I think I might have stayed there until dark. What got me up off the ground was the sound of a car door closing on the other side of the fence. Eleanor Whitfield walked across her driveway, opened the gate that connected our 2 properties, and walked into my backyard. Eleanor Whitfield was 62 years old. She had moved into the house next door 8 years earlier when her husband had retired from a career in television production in Atlanta. They had bought the historic Whitfield Henderson House, a 3-story federal-style home that had been built in 1897, and they had spent 4 years restoring it. What I did not know, for the first 3 years that Eleanor was my neighbor, was that Eleanor was the editor-in-chief of Town and Country magazine. I learned this in 2022 when Eleanor had asked me over the back fence one Saturday morning if I would consider designing the flowers for her only daughter Charlotte's upcoming wedding. She had told me that she had been watching me garden for 6 years and that she had never seen anyone with hands like mine. She had told me that her daughter wanted a southern garden wedding at her family home on Sea Island in mid-June of 2024. I had told her yes. For the previous 3 months, I had been designing the floral plan for that wedding. Charlotte's vision was a wild English garden style, but with southern coastal plants, magnolias, hydrangeas, old garden roses, ferns, Spanish moss. We had 400 guests on the list. The wedding was in less than 6 weeks. Eleanor walked across my backyard on that Monday afternoon. She was wearing a pair of dirty boots. She was holding a phone in her hand. She did not say anything to me at first. She walked over to the magnolia. She knelt down. She put her hand on the bark. Then she stood up and she walked over to me. "Emma, sweetheart, look at me." I looked at her. "How long have we been working together on Charlotte's wedding?" 3 months. "And how many wedding designers in this country could have done what you have been doing for me for 3 months?" I did not answer. "Emma, you are one of the great floral designers in the American South. I have known this for a year. I should have told you a year ago. I am so sorry I did not." She looked at the destruction. She looked at the magnolia on its side. She looked at the foreman, who was now standing 30 feet away, smoking a cigarette and watching us. She turned back to me. "Here is what is going to happen. The crew is going to leave for the day at 5 o'clock. I have already called my landscaper. His name is Diego Reyes. He runs the largest historic garden restoration company in coastal Georgia. He is sending a team of 12 people here at 6 o'clock tonight. We have until Friday morning, when the developer's crew comes back, to move every plant we can save onto my property." I started to cry. Eleanor put her hand on my shoulder. "Emma, you and I are going to spend the next 4 nights moving your mother's garden. I have 11,000 square feet behind my house. We are going to recreate the entire bed by the back fence. Every iris, every rose, every hydrangea. I have already found a master arborist in Beaufort who specializes in transplanting mature magnolias. He is driving down tomorrow morning. He thinks he can save the magnolia." I could not speak. "Charlotte's wedding is in 6 weeks. You are still doing the wedding. We are not changing one thing about the wedding. After the wedding, you and I are going to have a much longer conversation about what your career is supposed to look like. But tonight, we save the garden." She walked back to her house. Greg came out onto the back porch about 40 minutes later, while Diego Reyes' crew was unloading equipment in the alley behind the house. He saw the trucks. He saw the gardeners in coveralls. He saw Eleanor in the backyard wearing her dirty boots, marking plants with little orange flags. "Emma, what is going on?" "Greg, go inside. We are not having this conversation tonight." "Emma, I need to know what is happening on this property." Eleanor walked over. "Mr. Carter, my name is Eleanor Whitfield. I live next door. I have hired a crew to relocate every plant your wife wants to save onto my property. The crew has my full authorization. We will be working until Friday morning. Please do not interfere." Greg looked at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He went back into the house. We worked through the night. The 4 nights between Monday and Friday changed my life in ways I am still trying to understand. We saved 14 of my mother's roses, including the Pearls rose, which Diego's crew dug out at midnight on Tuesday with the original soil ball intact. We saved the dogwood. We saved 9 of the 11 antique hydrangeas. We saved the wisteria, which Diego rooted in temporary pots and replanted along Eleanor's back fence the following week. We saved the magnolia. The magnolia survived. The arborist from Beaufort, a man named Henrik Ostrom, brought a crane on Wednesday morning. They pulled the magnolia out with the entire root ball intact. They moved it across the fence at 4 in the afternoon. They replanted it in the back corner of Eleanor's property, next to a small fountain. Henrik told me, when he was done, that there was a 60% chance the tree would survive the transplant. He told me the next 12 months would tell. The magnolia is now 4 years old in its new location. It bloomed for the first time in May of last year. Eleanor calls it Margaret's tree. I moved out of the Ardsley Park house on Friday morning, the same day the developer's crew came back to clear the front yard. I moved into Eleanor's guest house, which is a one-bedroom carriage house at the back of her property. Eleanor would not accept rent. I lived there for 8 months. Charlotte's wedding happened in mid-June, 400 guests. The wedding was photographed by a team from Town and Country. The cover of the September issue had a photograph of the bridal arch I had built out of the surviving wisteria, the pearl's rose, and 3 branches of the dogwood. The cover headline read, "Heritage Garden, How One Designer Saved a Mother's Garden and Threw the Wedding of the Year." The article inside told the entire story. Town and Country's readership was 320,000 subscribers. The article was picked up by Garden and Gun, by Architectural Digest, by Veranda Magazine, by House Beautiful. By the end of August, I had over 120 inquiry emails for floral design work. I incorporated my company in October. I called it Carter Floral and Heritage Gardens. I rented a small studio space on 42nd Street, 3 blocks from the house I had grown up in. I hired 4 floral designers and 2 arborists. I started taking projects. In the first 6 months, I designed the floral and garden program for the wedding of a senator's granddaughter at the Whitfield Estate in Sea Island. I designed the gardens for the historic Green Meldrum House restoration. I built the floral design for a private dinner that the actress Reese Witherspoon hosted in Charleston for her book club. The Vogue feature came out last spring. The headline was, "The Florist Who Saved Her Mother's Garden." The article was 8 pages long. It was photographed by Annie Leibovitz. The cover photograph was me, kneeling next to the relocated Magnolia in Eleanor's backyard, holding a single pearl's rose in my hands. Vogue's article told the story differently than Town and Country's article had. Town and Country had focused on Charlotte's wedding. Vogue focused on Greg. PBS released a documentary series in November. The series is called Heritage Gardens. It airs nationally. Episode 1 is about my mother's garden. Episode 3 is about Pearl's Rose and the trip I took with a film crew to Asheville, North Carolina, to find the descendants of my great-grandmother who still lived on the original family farm. There is a scene in Episode 3 where I meet my second cousin, an 86-year-old woman named Doris, who pulls a small index card out of a Bible and shows me the only existing record of the breeding cross that produced Pearl's Rose in 1941. I cry in that scene. I cry every time I watch that scene. I established the Margaret Carter Foundation in March of this year. The foundation funds the preservation of heritage southern garden plants that are at risk of being lost to development. We have, as of last week, identified and rescued 241 varieties from properties scheduled for demolition across Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. I bought a house in Ardsley Park last summer. It is 2 blocks from the 48th Street house. I put my mother's garden notebook, which Greg had thrown into a recycling bin at our old house, but which I had recovered the following Monday by going through every recycling bin in the alley myself, in a glass display case in my front hallway. I have, behind my new house, a 1/4-acre lot. I have started a new garden. The Pearl's Rose, which Eleanor allowed me to take a cutting from when I moved out of her guest house, is in the back corner. The cutting is now a 6-foot bush. It bloomed for the first time last May. The blooms were exactly the color my mother had described to me when I was a child. The divorce went through last fall. Greg had hired a lawyer who told him he was entitled to half of the proceeds from any business I started during our marriage. The lawyer's argument fell apart the moment my lawyer, a woman in Savannah named Teresa McAllister, walked into the deposition room with 3 documents. The first was the Town and Country article. The second was the closing statement from the sale of the 48th Street property, which showed Greg's signature and only Greg's signature, and which was therefore a violation of Georgia's marital property laws because the house had been bought with my inheritance from my mother and was titled in my name only. The third was a copy of my mother's last will and testament, which had explicitly named me as the sole beneficiary of the house and the lot. Greg had not read the will carefully when he agreed to sell the property to the developer in April. The closing had been a fraud. Teresa filed a separate civil suit against the developer in October. We won. The developer settled with me for $420,000 in February of this year. I used the settlement to fund the first major project of the Margaret Carter Foundation. Greg lost his promotion at the insurance firm in November of last year. The firm did not give him an official reason. The unofficial reason, according to a former colleague of mine in Atlanta who still works in the industry, was that one of the firm's biggest commercial clients had read the Vogue article and asked for Greg to be removed from their account. Greg moved to a smaller firm in Macon in February. I do not know what he is doing now. About a month ago, in late March, the foundation hosted our first annual open garden tour at the Whitfield estate. Eleanor allowed us to use her property. 300 guests came. Tickets were $150 each. The proceeds went to the foundation. I gave a tour of the relocated garden. I showed people Margaret's Magnolia. I showed them the Pearl's Rose. I told them the story. At the end of the tour, a man in a gray windbreaker was standing in the back of the group. He was wearing sunglasses. He had a wine glass in his hand. He did not ask any questions. I recognized him. When the tour ended, the crowd dispersed across the back lawn for the cocktail hour. The man in the windbreaker walked toward me through the crowd. He stopped about 15 feet away. "Emma, the garden looks beautiful." I did not respond. I just wanted to see it. I had seen the Vogue article. He did not finish the sentence. I looked at him. I tried to feel something. I could not feel anything. He was not anyone to me anymore. He was a man who had paid $150 to attend an event at the home of the woman who had saved my life. "Sir, the cocktail hour is from 5 to 7. The bar is over by the fountain. Please enjoy your evening." I walked past him. I did not look back. He left the property within 10 minutes. He has not come back. Today, I am writing this from the back porch of my new house in Ardsley Park, 2 blocks from the lot where my mother's garden used to be. The Pearl's Rose is blooming. The cutting is now 6 feet tall. There are 7 blooms on it this morning, all of them the deep coral color my mother described to me when I was a child. My mother's leather notebook is open on the small table next to me. I have been adding to it for 2 years. The new section is titled The Recovered Garden. I have written 14 new entries in my own handwriting, in the same blue ink my mother always used. There is a small framed photograph next to the notebook. The photograph is of my mother and me, taken in 1988 when I was 6. We are standing in front of the Magnolia. It was 3 years old at the time. My mother is holding a single Pearl's Rose in her hand. She is laughing. I am wearing a yellow sundress. I keep that photograph on my work table now. I look at it every morning. There are some things a man can sell to a developer in 2 hours that took a woman 30 years to grow. But there are some roots a backhoe cannot reach. The roots of a daughter who learned to garden at her mother's knees go deeper than any contract a husband can sign behind her back. The roots of a woman who has been told her work is just a hobby go deeper than a yellow excavator can dig. My mother taught me, when I was 4 years old, that a garden is not a place. A garden is a relationship between a woman, a piece of earth, and the time she is willing to spend in it. My husband sold a piece of earth. He did not sell the woman who knew how to put her hands in it, and he did not sell the time. The time was already mine. The garden grew back. Some women grow into something the old garden could never have held.